Hello, welcome to Science at Scale, a webinar series brought to you by Argonne National Laboratory. My name is Justin Bro. Science at Scale is a forum for Argonne and industry experts to engage in conversation about the latest in science and technology about the challenges facing us in the 21st century. Today we'll be speaking about how to make your grid more resilient. Joining us today, we have Mark Petri, Argonne's Grid Electric Program Director, as well as Andy Ott, former President and Chief Executive Officer for PJM. Welcome both of you to Science at Scale.
Thank you, Justin.
Sure. So a couple of housekeeping notes for you. Your mics have been muted upon entry, but we do want to hear from you. If you do have questions or comments, please use the chat feature in Blue Jeans to be able to make your comments, and we'll address those near the end of the program in the question and answer period. And the second housekeeping note I'd like to make is that we are here to demonstrate Argonne's value to you. To that point, we're open for business. If you do see something during this program that sparks your interest, makes you think that you want to partner with Argonne, please send us an email to science@anl.gov, and we'll go full screen with that email right there. So traditionally, the electric grid system generated power at a central generating station, transported it along distances and across transmission lines, and delivered it at lower voltages in the utility distribution system into our homes and businesses. Those features still exist today, but as you know, with the introduction of wind farms, rooftop solar panels on the distribution system, electric vehicles, microgrids, battery energy storage, large amounts of data collected by sensors, all these things, including increased automation, this picture is evolving. So with that set up, I want to bring in Argonne's Mark Petri to discuss the complex web of energy production and distribution. Welcome, Mark. Okay. So my first question for you is, can you talk a little bit about the interconnected nature of infrastructure and how this affects the performance of the grid?
Thank you, Justin. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about the evolving reliability of the grid. Over the past several years, if we were to look at the length of the average outage broadly across the U.S., if you don't count major events, then that outage length has been fairly constant, about an hour or an hour and a half per disruption. But if you do count major events, ice storms, hurricanes, severe weather events, heat waves, then the average outage length has grown from about 1 hour per outage to over 6 hours per outage. Now, my take on that is that all of the changes that you've talked about with the evolving grid probably have improved the reliability, or at least haven't reduced the reliability of the grid. But the grid has been seeing an increasingly set of growing challenges and assaults that are causing these long outages. One of those challenges has been the growing complexity of interdependencies among different critical infrastructures. So if you think about the natural gas system, for instance, and if we could maybe go to the next slide, we know that today natural gas has displaced coal as our #1 source of electricity generation. About 36% of our power comes from natural gas. We need electricity to keep that natural gas flowing. But likewise, if we lose the natural gas system, we're going to lose a significant amount of our electrical production. And this type of interdependency, whether it's natural gas or telecommunications or the petroleum industry, has been growing over time so that disruptions that occur in one of those systems easily propagate into challenges with the electric power grid system. Now, Argonne does a lot of work looking at these interdependencies. We study and develop models and tools to look at what the behavior is of the electric system, the telecommunications system, the natural gas system, the petroleum system, so that we can have informed decisions about how to make investments to try to make the system more resilient in that way.
Excellent, thank you. So Andy, I know you've been listening in, and so your previous job had to do with moving electricity over large areas. Can you help us understand via a couple of examples of what Mark was just explaining?
Yeah, Justin. So what we're seeing is essentially an increased dimension in these interdependencies. Of course, you have the just-in-time fuel delivery on the pipeline system. The electric grid now is increasingly dependent on gas pipeline infrastructure. You have smarter technologies, the penetration of more innovative technologies on the power grid, so therefore we're increasingly dependent for power system operations on the telecommunication system. I'll give you a couple examples of things we've actually seen on the grid. Last winter, I was in the control room. We actually had a 1,300 megawatt gas plant trip offline.
Wow.
4 hours later, the thing comes back on, and then an hour later, it trips again. That kind of large plant, when it was a coal plant, they couldn't come on and off that quickly. Once they went off, they were off for a while. These gas plants are much more flexible and have much more flexible capabilities, but with that comes additional uncertainties. Another example of in the Midwest, we had a situation where all of the wind turbines in one area of the Midwest, thousands of megawatts, all went off at the same time because of an electronic setting where once the temperature reached minus 25 degrees C, they all went offline to protect the wind blades from the cold weather. So what we need here is a situation where looking at these types of changes and interdependencies, in order to maintain the same level of reliability, we need to evolve.
Excellent. So, like, if I get you, you're talking about these, and you mentioned this before, actually, before the program, these dimensions of interdependence, right, and how they work together. And I want to go back to Mark because we talked about one particular example. Actually, Andy talked about a couple of different examples, but there are a growing number of external threats that that system operators have to deal with. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
You make a really good point, Justin. What we've been talking about up till this point has been the systemic challenges within the evolving grid system itself, but more and more we're seeing these external threats to the system. We can just look back over the past year at earthquakes in California, or the polar vortices in New England, or the hurricanes in the Atlantic and the Gulf region. And hardly a day goes by without us reading about attempts to hack into the grid system and other critical infrastructure. And we can't forget what's happening in California right now. There are at least 7 wildfires that are currently raging in the state. And that has made disruptions in the electric power grid system and telecommunications. But even when there hasn't been an actual fire, the utilities have been forced to cut power preemptively to hundreds of thousands of customers just in case there's the potential of a spark coming from the electrical infrastructure. Now, Argonne has been studying all of these types of threats to understand what the risks are involved. And with the wildfires, for instance, we're developing a lot of wildfire risk mapping, both for near-term weather-based forecasting, but also looking long-term in terms of how the climate is going to change and what the likelihood of drought conditions and fire conditions are going to look like in the future.
I'd like to bring Andy in this conversation, talk a little bit more about the evolution of this whole situation.
Yeah, well, what we're seeing, in fact, is the threats are evolving. Historically, we worried about on the power grid equipment failure and weather-related events. That was essentially the focus. Today, the dimensions of, again, threats are expanding. We have intentional attacks on infrastructure. We have cyber threats. You have increasingly interdependent systems, and if something goes out on one system, like the telecom system or the gas system, you could have a power system repercussion. So the dimensionality of this, again, is growing, and we have to focus on that. As, again, if we're going to maintain the types of readiness, if you will, our models have to reflect that.
So if you're just joining us, you are joining us with Science at Scale. It's a program brought to you by Argonne National Laboratory. Essentially, we are bringing you Argonne and industry experts to have conversations about science and technology and the grand challenges that we face in the 21st century. So we just heard from Andy Ott. He's former President and Chief Executive Officer of PJM, and we're talking about these dimensions of interdependencies and the evolving nature of the grid system and how we can create it more resilient, create more resiliency, as it were. So at this point, I sort of want to pivot because we've talked about reliability, and the words I've been hearing lately, particularly come from Argonne, is resilience. And so, Mark, I want to come back to you insofar as what the difference of that is, and if not just the difference, like how do we move from a conversation of reliability to resilience?
So let's start with those definitions. So a reliable system is one that delivers electric power when it's needed and at the quality that's needed. Resiliency is a little bit different. A resilient grid has the ability to withstand an incoming attack and be able to respond quickly so that power can be brought back online as quickly as possible. So that's the distinction. And I think this chart that I have here can help illustrate this a little bit. So initially, the power grid is operating normally. The power is being generated and consumed at the right sort of balance. But even before the event occurs, there might be signs that there's a likely problem about to emerge. And if we can detect that early enough, we can actually prevent the event from occurring or make sure that the damage isn't as bad as it could be. And once the event actually does occur, then you might ask the question, how bad is it? How far down does this drop in performance go? And if you can minimize that, then you've improved resiliency. The next question is how fast the operators can respond. What actions can they take to try to bring the system back up as quickly as possible? Are there alternative ways to flow the power through the system? And then finally, it's a question of being able to fully recover and bring the system back to a stable position, hopefully at the same level of performance that we had before. So anything that you can do to improve any of these steps along the way is a way of improving the resiliency of the grid system. And it shouldn't surprise you that Argonne is involved in many of these aspects of identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and recovering to events in the system. Argonne does a lot of work on identifying what the external threats are to the system, whether they're natural or man-made, understanding what the vulnerabilities are of the systems themselves. And remember, it's not just the electric power grid system, it's these interdependent critical infrastructures that we're talking about as well, such as natural gas. And finally, it's translating that science into practical tools and technologies that can actually be used in the field to make a difference.
I'm going to toss it over to Andy at this point.
Well, and again, I agree with Mark. What again, the grid operators, grid owners, we essentially plan the grid to maintain reliability, maintain seamless operation, while losing the most critical piece of equipment. So we essentially plan for that, plan ahead for that. The system in the U.S. is, in fact, the most reliable in the world. Mm. However, what we're seeing increasingly in operations is we're actually, instead of losing one critical piece of equipment, we're actually losing multiple pieces of equipment. And again, whether that's, again, because of a more severe weather, whether it's because of these dependencies, et cetera. So the point is we are actually experiencing events that are beyond our planning criteria. So essentially when you think of resilience, you think of that. You think of what is it going to take for us to bounce back, if you will, from these extreme events. In other words, you're not going to be able to withstand everything. But how do we get back quicker? How do we actually make the system ready to respond to severe events and get back quicker?
Excellent. So we're going to transition to emergency preparedness now. And so when it comes to forecasting extreme events and helping train system operators to be better prepared in emergencies, there are a few organizations that can match Argonne's expertise. I mean, it's all on one campus. So now it feels like we buried the lead here. So I want to really get to the why. So we have this program, we have Science at Scale. It's a device to have people out there in the world come partner with Argonne. So let's go into the why at this point. And Mark, can you tell us how your team can help system operators prepare for an emergency?
I'd be happy to. So I think that this area of emergency preparedness and response is really the low-hanging fruit when it comes to grid resiliency. The better prepared we are, the systems and the people involved are for these events, then the better we're going to be able to respond to these systems and get our critical infrastructure back online again. So Argonne, one of the premier programs that Argonne has is our Hurricane Hazard Assessment Model. This is the program of record for the U.S. government for forecasting damage from incoming hurricanes. This code has been used for every hurricane season since 2013. It looks at NOAA hurricane weather center data and then translates that into where the potential damage is to electrical infrastructure and then projects where the customer outages are going to be. And the value of this is so that system operators and responders can do a much better job of identifying what spare equipment needs to be purchased and staging the crews ahead of landfall. So what you're seeing here, for instance, these are our projections 2.5 days ahead of time before the landfall of Hurricane Michael, which was a Category 5 hurricane that hit the Florida Panhandle in October of last year. Again, these are projections that we're making 2.5 days ahead of time. In this case, our outage predictions were very precise. On the day of landfall, it was calculated that there were 900,000 outages, and the Argonne projections for that were within about 1%. Moving forward, we can use this kind of expertise that we have in understanding these types of external threats to actually help operators and responders be able to do emergency exercises for these types of events. So what you're looking at here is Hurricane Cora, which was a Category 4 hurricane that ran along the East Coast and then slammed into the U.S. Capitol. Now, if you haven't heard of Hurricane Cora, that shouldn't surprise you because it's not a real hurricane. This is a simulated hurricane that Argonne helped develop with NOAA to exercise over 12,000 participants in the FEMA national level exercise earlier this year. It's a hurricane that looks to be bearing down on Florida, runs off into the Atlantic, and then slams into the U.S. Capitol region. Now, what made this event possible was an earlier simulation that we did partnering with PJM for one of their system training exercises. And so this was an opportunity to get a reality check on the kind of models that Argonne was developing to do moment-by-moment projections of what the outages in the system might be. So those types of collaboration has been really valuable. And let me ask Andy maybe to comment on this.
Well, thanks, Mark. Again, I think as we see the grid is changing. It's been evolving for several years, but I think the pace of change on the grid is accelerating. What we're seeing is demand, the way smart systems are responding to events. The demand is different. The supply, as I had indicated before in some examples, has changed. In fact, we see social media has an impact. We had a situation last winter where extreme cold weather, we had over forecasted essentially what the demand would be by about 6,000 megawatts. And it was largely because people were aware of the weather, businesses closed down, schools closed, we got less demand than we thought. But all of that interdependency, the last thing you want in a grid operation situation is a surprise. You don't want to be surprised. You don't want to be unprepared. So what we've seen is these training scenarios where you expect the unexpected. Our operators are actually seeing, if you will, these happen in training scenarios. So they're much better prepared for the actual uncertainty in system operations. So it's been a great collaboration.
It seems to me that these types of events aren't going away. We're going to continue to see hurricanes. We're going to continue to see wildfires and these other types of events. So what can you do to have to be in the best position to be able to respond to these events? And I do think that the better you can make these scenarios, the more realistic the training situations are, then the better training is going to take place and the better the response is going to be.
And better predictive models make better operations. And that's really where we're at, is to get more prepared, better information to the people running the infrastructure, and that's essentially where we're headed.
Perfect. Better preparedness, better simulations, better models, better prepared that you are as the grid operator or system operator. At this point, I think we're going to go to our Q&A, and I'm going to ask our staff here and see if we have any questions that came in that you can answer. So I'll start off with my first question. And this is going to be for Mark. So we might have a number of people wondering, like, how can you work with Argonne? How can we get in contact? Let's go ahead, guys. Can we put up the full screen of science@scale@anl.gov. So that's one of the ways, but I want to talk to you specifically about how can someone, a system operator, an RTO, partner with Argonne on this particular type of project?
There are a number of ways to do that. We can partner directly as a collaborative agreement. Argonne has a number of contracting mechanisms that allow that to occur. One way that's been very successful for our working with PJM, for instance, has been jointly putting proposals in to the Department of Energy, so that it's the federal government that is funding the collaboration. But that doesn't have to be the only way that we can do this type of work. So, for instance, we have a CRADA with PJM. A CRADA is a collaborative research and development agreement, and it's an agreement between Argonne as a national laboratory and an industrial partner to do joint research that's protected by non-disclosure agreements and IP protections and those types of concerns that the lawyers might have.
Okay, we just had one question, and it's actually for Andy. What is your conception of the grid of the future?
Well, I think the grid of the future is one that is much more adaptable. I think that as I had indicated in some of the discussion, we're seeing more distributed resources. We're seeing alternative technologies, both in production of power and the consumption of power. We're seeing smarter systems where they react, based on technology. So I think that continues to evolve. I think you're also going to see a blurring, if you will, of the interface between distribution and transmission. I think the way that the system is evolving, the notion of that the distribution system is only the place where you send the power one way and it goes down to people to consume. It may actually carry power from businesses and homes in some circumstances.
And that has some with the solar panels, right? You can sell your energy back. Right?
Could be that, absolutely. And I think you mentioned that you're selling back, if you will. I think the other big trend we're seeing is again the way that the utility infrastructure is bought and paid for. The sort of the regulatory process. That's probably going to need to evolve as business models change and the way people think about energy is going to change. Last but not least, essentially people want cleaner, greener, and more reliable systems, and that is, again, when you talk about the dimensionality, if you will, of expectation of the consumer. So I think the grid of the future is one that has to be much more adaptable.
Okay. I'm also seeing that there's much more interest in consumer choices in the marketplace and services at the edge. Right. People generating their own power, battery systems, electric vehicles that are a revenue source for consumers as well.
Exactly, right. I mean, they understand a little bit better about the fact that they have choices and they want to exercise those choices. And again, consumer preference is changing. We need to adapt with it as an industry.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both. We have come to the close of our program. My name is Justin Breaux. This has been Science at Scale. Our program today was about how to increase the reliability of your grid. Again, if you do want to contact us because you want to partner with Argonne, please send us an email to science@scale@anl.gov. I want to thank Andy Ott, former president and chief executive officer of PJM, and of course, Mark Petri, director of Argonne's electric grid program. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.
We're always looking towards the future, but the future is here. And the reality of it is we need to react today. Our focus in the Office of Electricity is on national security, how we can really leverage the assets in the system, work with our partners in industry to optimally utilize these and build the level of resilience that we need to in the grid, and develop operational strategies and capabilities to enable the delivery of energy services to the most critical infrastructure throughout the United States. Our society's fabric is really based upon the availability of electricity. And we've grown to the point where many different aspects, if not all aspects, of critical infrastructure sectors are reliant upon electricity. Our society, our economics, our financial engines, our food delivery, our transportation systems, basic computer technology all rely on electricity, which is why we've started to develop the North American Energy Resiliency Model. What the model is really meant to do is to fully integrate all the energy infrastructure to provide situational awareness to the industry so that we can make the system more resilient. Working through the transmission system, which we're responsible for, we're able to deploy capabilities to actually put them into a real system. We've already been able to realize a 1,000-time improvement on our sensing capability. Storage at a megawatt scale will enable the system to ride through events, to stabilize the system and make it more resilient. To help the recovery effort in Puerto Rico, we've gone through and optimized the amount of generation and where it needs to be in an effort to stabilize the island. We have the 4 power marketing administrations that take power that's generated at federal hydro facilities, transmitting it through approximately 2 million square miles of the United States. The national labs are an integral part of the success of and a partner in the Office of Electricity, particularly as we develop the North American Energy Resiliency Model. As we identify problems within the system, we have the opportunity, working with our labs and academia, to develop solution sets for that and then to deploy them. Our partnerships are critically important. We work very closely through the Electric Sector Coordinating Council as well as the Oil and Natural Gas Coordinating Council to bring together industry as well as trade organizations all in one place. Furthermore, we work very closely with FERC and with NERC to understand modeling, understand some of the analysis that they've done, and also make sure that what we're doing is consistent. We are the one place where all of the different energy infrastructure come together. Now we're looking to use the model, work with our partners in industry who know this business inside and out, and identify those planned investments, operational strategies that enable us to increase the resiliency of the grid. Not only are we developing the tools for tomorrow, but we're making those investments in the system today.